afternoon. It is 2 o'clock Eastern Time, Sunday, August 16th, and I am excited to get started with our fourth and final summer webinar, Flexible Instructional Planning. So we started from the very basics of using Google Slides to make Bitmoji classrooms. We expanded those tools to create interactive and adaptive learning materials. Last week, we talked about how to assess our students both for amplified learning loss and to gauge their understanding through teaching and learning cycles. And today we are putting it all together, how to organize ourselves and plan for the unknown, as we know we will be switching between our socially distant in-person classrooms, hybrid learning, and online classrooms. As we have been doing, this is streaming on my YouTube channel, and all of the resources will be in the notes section of my Facebook page. They should be linked in the description of this video right now, and I will be posting as soon as I am done live streaming. There are also 2 Facebook groups to discuss questions and thoughts and ideas after the webinar, the interactive materials collaboration to talk everything technology, and the reimagining education discussion to talk research and ideas about planning for now and post-pandemic, the changes the education system needs to see. I am Jane Natalie. I'm an instructional coach in Connecticut, in New England of the United States, and I have been teaching for 10 years. I got involved online during shutdown during COVID and joined Facebook groups and got connected with this wonderful group of online collaborators. And I've been so excited to get to know you all and share some of my passions and my lessons learned and my ongoing learning as we are all learning together. And I hope you stay in touch with me. After this series is over, you can reach me directly at my email or whichever social media outlet you prefer. So today we are going to bring our focus of reinventing education back to the kids. We are going to planning to be flexible, and we are going to talk about how to organize and structure our teaching and learning for school year 2021. As I planned this final webinar, I found myself going off on tangents in my research in so many directions. I was scrolling through various Facebook groups. I saw the questions teachers were asking each other. I've watched the news about the struggles to and the politics behind reopening our school buildings. I've looked up models of student-centered approaches to motivate students to take ownership over their learning. And I finally reached out to my mentor about an article I found about inspiring students to be entrepreneurs. I was excited, and his response, in a nutshell, and to paraphrase, was, "We have all the ideas we need on how to reform education to last a lifetime. It is time to double down on our efforts to teach students how to learn. We need to ensure that every student is receiving grade level instruction. We need to ask for a defined professional learning plan and an assessment strategy that actually works for us as teachers and as adult learners. This has been an amazing month of learning for me, synthesizing the research and the advice from experts on how to tackle hybrid and distance learning. It has helped me get myself into a good headspace to start the school year out as an instructional coach in my school building. And it has strengthened some of my already existing belief systems, such as, if students can Google the answer to your quiz question, you're asking the wrong questions. Instead of figuring out how students can interact with the worksheet virtually, ask yourself, what's the purpose of this task? It is time to truly embrace the shifts in the public education system that have been going on around us. Listening to John Hattie, Tony Wagner, Sir Ken Robinson, to name a few. It's time to put aside the worksheet and embrace an authentic task. It's time to focus on the learning and the learner. And now that has never been more important. A big document I read and thought about this week was from ANA and Transforming Education called Head and Heart. And it talked about everything that goes into what our students need from us right now. The world, and especially the United States, is in political and social turmoil. More than ever before, we cannot open our classroom doors this year and pretend the world outside the school doesn't exist. Relationships with our students and our social emotional support for one another are going to matter more than any other year. If we're in person, those relationships will mean we're keeping each other safe and healthy. If we're at home, those relationships will help maintain positive emotional health and reduce isolation for both our students and ourselves. It's been a long 6 months of coronavirus, and it's not over yet. Hopefully in another 6 months, it will be behind us. In the meantime, let's get to work putting the humanity back into our school system and focus on what matters the most, the people. This afternoon, I'm going to end up leaving you with more questions than answers. I hope to give you plenty of tips and tricks to make the technology work for you. But when it comes down to implementing your own instruction, there isn't one right way to do it. I have some advice for you based on the many lessons learned as I've worked with and many people have worked with students of all ages and abilities throughout the spring and summer. And I sincerely invite you back to our Facebook group after this presentation to continue the conversation in context to your specific situations. We all know these words. We're using them constantly now. We need to look at what our specific schools and our specific grades and our classes are looking at as we open our doors. What combination of synchronous and asynchronous learning will we have for our students? Are you going back full-time in person? Are you going back in a hybrid model? Are we all assuming it's only inevitable to be at home again sooner rather than later? So let's plan to be flexible, and let's keep teaching and learning at the forefront to help us drive the decisions we're making for our instruction. I put together this little graphic because it helped me structure my thinking. That as the school year starts and moves along, we are going to be tempted to jump in with our content and our curriculum to start to pick up where we left off and catch kids up. And the research is clear and has all agreed that a constant state of remediation is not what we want for our students. We need to look at accelerating their learning, meeting them where they are, and moving them forward to close gaps and get them ahead. And this is how I think we can frame our minds to do that. Get to know your students. Everybody needs to get comfortable with the technology you will be using this year. And then we need to spend a good amount of time learning how to be learners, especially in these hybrid and remote environments. And if we set that stage, I think the learning will take off regardless of what model we're in. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. First, let's talk about the students and the tech. And I think we can get to know our students and our technology at the same time as our school years start. Just a couple of our basic get to know your students that might be good reminders, refreshers for you, or if you're just getting started, these are some typical things that go into getting to know you questionnaires at the beginning of the year. And I want to stress more than ever, especially if you're online, learning how to pronounce kids' pronounce kids' names is one of the most basic ways we can welcome them into our classrooms from the very beginning and make sure we are making an inclusive environment. So learn how to pronounce their names, even if they're not sitting in front of you. Then my best advice is to organize your learning management system now as if you were going to be fully remote. And there's different ways you can use it now to help you get acclimated to it in case you do end up at home. You can use it to post whatever texts you're using, resources, take pictures of your anchor charts, post copies of your notes for students. It might actually end up being a good resource even if we're in school. You can use it for absent students to catch up with the work. And then while we are in our classrooms, whether it's fully in school or a hybrid, we want to make sure that we are practicing using that learning management system. We're practicing protocols to communicate with each other online where we just can't raise our hand in class. And we are practicing what it will look like when we have to maximize our class time in hybrid locations or maximize our Zoom time if we are fully remote, and that is through that flipped classroom, which really does put the ownership on students to be an active participant in their learning, which is crucial and a good thing. And then you want to make sure you're going to be practicing any tools now that you'll use remote. And this is the blessing that we have right now that we did not have in the spring, where we had to go home without any notice and get this up and running. And that's why we call that crisis teaching, not distance teaching. And now we have the opportunity to roll it out in a more organized fashion in the fall. Our students, like I said, need to be active learners, and there are things that we can put into place and talk about with them to make sure that we are on the same page about what that means. I have linked this entire document in our resource. It's a list of questions for you to look at in terms of what does this look like in person, in hybrid, and in remote. What does it mean to come to my lesson prepared? What does it mean to engage in the learning? And there are some questions in there about academic honesty, which we will get to later on as well. How do we make sure that our students are participating in their learning, having ownership over themselves as learners? And too often we take these things for granted, especially as students get older. And really the question becomes, have we as teachers set this context and these classroom expectations in very clear and measurable terms for students to be able to even answer them with any degree of efficacy? So these are things that we can have conversations around as we get to learn our learning management systems and tools that we use, and a good way to set the stage for learning at the beginning of the year, regardless of what mode we're in. Once we do that, our classrooms can start buzzing with the learning and the teaching. And it all comes back to the instructional core, which in a nutshell talks about how is the teacher and the student engaging with that content. And now we need to talk about that. What does it mean when we're in person versus what does it mean when we're in remote? But it still all comes down to that instructional task in the center of that triangle. Last week, we talked about the teaching and learning cycle in terms of assessment, checking for prerequisite skills and also for new learning as a result of our instruction. And this week, we are talking about the actual teaching components in between that makes up the teaching and learning cycle. So I'm going to show you another graphic display. This is how my brain works. I really like concept mapping for myself and for students. It helps me organize and synthesize complex information. And like I showed you last week, I really recommend it as a tool for your students. So this is just a quick cycle of what our teachers are used to doing. We introduce new topics, integrate new information, provide opportunities for practice and application, and then we assess and adjust. What are our students doing along that cycle? They are reflecting on their prior knowledge. Where are they coming to the table as we approach a new topic? As they get new information, and how are they deepening their understanding? How are they adjusting their thinking as they get that new information? Is it new understanding? Is it a deeper understanding of a topic they've already been exposed to? Or is it different understanding? Are they unlearning something, or did they have misconceptions that they are now correcting in their thinking? They are deliberately practicing, either organizing that information, synthesizing, or practicing a new skill. And then they are asking questions and answering them with their classmates and us, and they are applying their thinking to authentic situations. That helps them solidify their understanding of the new information so that they can then reflect on their learning and set new goals, and the cycle starts over again. So this is a graphic organization of what is called the 5E model. It's been around since the 80s. It's come from research on science curriculum designed for student collaboration and problem solving. And I made this chart for you so that you would have it going forward. But I really want to take a look at the difference between looking at a chart and looking at a graph here. So I'm going to come out of presentation mode for a second. And I have, you should see the 5 E's on the side, and they match up with my graphic representation, right? We engage students in new topics. We help them explore the new information and take it in and adjust their thinking. We help them explain their thinking by asking and answering questions, and extend their thinking by applying it to authentic situations, and then evaluate their learning and set new goals. And that little demonstration is something that they can do as well, collaborating with each other, categorizing, understanding, and it helps us shift our thinking in how are we as teachers presenting information, and how are we asking students to engage with information. When you are giving them complex topics to analyze and discuss and take in, especially when you're not in front of them, what are you asking them to do with that information to help them integrate it into their brains? And that brings us to the question, who is in the driver's seat of the learning? Is the student taking ownership, or is the teacher kind of dragging them along? This is another way to organize our thinking about instruction. This is a newer document called Instructional Planning Guides put out by Achieve the Core. And I just want to point out a couple of things that really speak to me, as there is a lot of overlap, but we want to make sure that students are doing the work, that it's the teacher's job to probe that thinking and expect evidence and precision. And precision is important in the terms that they're using the right language for the content area, and they're giving you full answers. They're explaining their thinking beyond giving you a simple response or an almost right answer. And then how do they refine their thinking through written and oral responses. So it's our job to look at how are we putting out tasks and activities that get them through this learning process. And that's a big task, but we might have heard this little joke before. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And we're going to take it one step at a time as we are planning our instruction. And then we also know the moral of this famous fable, who wins the race, the tortoise or the hare? And we know that slow and steady gets us there, and we don't burn out along the way. So I'm going to put this graphic back up one more time to really emphasize we want to take our time getting to know our students at the beginning of the school year. We want to take our time getting comfortable with the technology and learning what it means to be learners. And as you can see, I've put back up some of Hattie's effect sizes that we talked about last week in terms of what is that effective practice when we are working with our students. And that teacher credibility has a much higher effect size than that distance education. Not that distance education is going to be a negative impact. It's not going to make a difference whether we're online or in person if we are putting all of the good practices of teaching and learning that we know into play. That learning how to be learners cannot be stressed enough. Self-reported grades as part of Hattie's barometer is one of the absolute highest effect sizes on learning. And that means that students have an accurate understanding of themselves as learners and what they're accomplishing. And if they can set goals and meet them and reflect on their learning, that will accelerate their process of learning more than almost anything else. And then I also have listed, again, some common practices that we can put into play, whether we are in class or at home. And you see concept mapping is on that list, that deliberate practice, that summarizing information. Those are all things that we can teach students how to do independently. I'm also going to talk a little bit more about how some of that looks in person or in practice. I'm going to take a drink. That has been quite a bit of content so far. And I want to invite you to think about what is some of your shifts in thinking, or where does this align with your thinking, or where did this bring your thinking to a new direction as you start to plan the school year, or maybe as your school year has already gotten underway. Okay. Now let's talk about the actual technology. What does this look like? How are we going to set up our learning management systems? And this is some of my best advice based on lessons learned in the spring and the summer. And I'm putting out the disclaimer that everybody is in a different situation. Learning management systems have different functionality. Schools have different requirements of teachers. Teams are working in different ways. So these are just ideas to get you thinking, and by no means are they the only possibility for moving forward. I would love to hear what you have that is working for you in our Facebook groups, if it is not something that is on the next few slides. So the first thing I recommend to people is really make sure that you have an organized draft space, meaning you know where you're creating and storing your instructional materials, and everybody who needs access to them can get to them. So this might be through your Microsoft Teams with other teachers. It might be through your Google Drive shared folders if you're a Google school, and make sure that everybody knows how to access it first. That's going to be really helpful going forward so that everybody can just move along as they need to. And that we've also seen a lot of draft classrooms, or Canvas calls it a sandbox. And that means you are creating your practice materials or your draft materials in one space, and then you are transferring them over to your live classroom with your students when you're ready. And I have worked with teams of teachers in the spring, especially when one was a little bit more tech savvy and another teacher wasn't. And this was a really helpful tool that everybody could, bring what they had as strengths to the table and work together. And then we were able to copy out into our individual classrooms in the when it was ready for the instruction. And a important piece to note here is really understand what you need to do with the material afterwards. The first time we did a shared Google form for a quiz, we didn't make separate copies of them for our teachers before they put them out there. And so then all of the student information got mixed together. So a lot of times just a simple like make a copy when it's complete will separate out separate materials from getting mixed with other people's students. Just play around with that and make sure that everybody's on the same page with how we're managing your draft materials and then what that looks like when it goes into the live version. And then consistency. I cannot stress enough how helpful being consistent is for the students in your class, as well as for students who share a group of teachers. So I spent a lot of time on the phone in the spring with parents and students trying to just find their work. And when their different classrooms were organized differently, it made it that much harder for students to get to the actual instructional materials. So I've put together a list of questions. It's in the resources. Again, there's no real right or wrong answer here, but a little consistency does go a long way across your team of teachers. And I highly recommend you take these questions if you're not already having these conversations and talking in your teams and your departments about how are you getting yourselves organized so that students know how to find and access and interact with you in virtual spaces as consistently as possible. A few of those items are organizing your actual lessons into chunks of learning. And there is a whole conversation online of topic versus a date system. And that is going to depend on your students and your school system and what works for you. I have found that especially for younger students, making sure that everything has a date on it and they can click on Wednesday's assignment when it is Wednesday without any question has been the best way to keep younger students moving forward. But really, you just want to make sure that students can find the information they need with the fewest clicks or the less scrolling as possible. And I recommend having an intuitive test of your virtual space by asking another adult to join your class or look at your class as a student, or even from your view with a fresh pair of eyes. Because if an adult cannot find your assignments, then a student is not going to be able to find your assignments. So work together and try to make it as intuitive as possible. This is worth a few seconds to talk about naming conventions when you are naming both your draft workspaces and documents and folders, as well as your assignments that students are going to have. And a general rule of thumb is put the specific information first, and then have a string toward the more general information. If you're using a program within the G Suite, you really don't have that much limitation on how long your titles can be. So include as much identifying information as possible. When we started working with Google years ago, people thought I was crazy to really harp on naming conventions and clear and inclusive names and of titles of documents and folders, until somebody lost a folder in their Google Drive. And when we went to go search for it, there were 150 folders named grade 3. And we couldn't figure out which one was which in order to find the information back. So I have some examples there for you to illustrate the point of put specific information first, so that when you're looking at a list of files, you see the most relevant information at the beginning of the title, and then include as much as you can. And then a quick couple of tips to force your files or your folders to be in an order other than alphabetical or last touched or whatever is to put numbers at the beginning. And that will put them in a numerical order, and you can manage that. You can also use an asterisk or any of the other special symbols, if in Google I know will allow you to do that. And then that will force those documents to the front of the list. I will often do that with a list of folders if it's for grade level, so that kindergarten goes before grade 1, as just another tip there. And then speaking of, students and what they're going through at home and how they're managing all of this remote learning, be considerate of their total workload, especially if they are younger. I know in the spring, in our elementary and middle schools especially, we would have teachers who, very thoughtfully were putting in, a warm-up activity, a lesson, an exit ticket for each day. And there's nothing wrong with that. And there's certainly great practice in the classroom. But when you look at the total number of things kids need to click on and do, it gets overwhelming really quickly. So just take into consideration the number of assignments over the week of classes that kids have, especially if you're fully at home and students might not have parental support while parents are at work, or if they have special needs or anxiety in any way. That number of things to complete can get very overwhelming very quickly. Speaking of getting overwhelming very quickly, the number of notifications adults are going to be getting as these students start submitting and generating work and putting in comments and questions. And so get to know your learning management system and all of the settings that it has. And unfortunately, they're not always that easy to find. So I've put up some common icons here for what to look for hidden settings and more options. And they're pretty much inside some kind of 3 dots if you're in a Google product. The settings cog wheel is very common across products to look for those settings. And you can manage how you'll get notifications from your classes. I've put in the resources a link to how that works in Google Classroom, and there's a lot of information out there on the other learning platforms, especially if you are sharing classrooms with other teachers. The notifications get pretty voluminous pretty quickly. So learn your settings. Another thing to set up, which would be great to have consistently across a team of teachers, but at least consistent in your own classroom, how are you going to answer student questions? How can they get a hold of you? And what is your preferred method? I definitely recommend teaching students how to use email. I think that was one of the biggest surprises in the spring, that students of all ages did not know the basics of email. And then what other methods are available to you? Are you going to be doing virtual office hours or using a chat feature? I have video links right on this slide for both Gmail and Google products and Microsoft Teams. Gmail has upgraded since the spring to have Hangouts right inside your email, which is really helpful. You can chat back and forth with students and you can call them, you can make small groups. It's really a powerful feature in terms of getting some real-time interaction. I know a complaint students had in the spring was they would be ready to work on something and they'd have a question and there wasn't anybody on the other side immediately to answer them. And so a group chat feature somehow, students can answer each other questions, and that also gives you options there. So you certainly don't need to use all of these, right? The point is to create a system that works, that streamlines the process, that students understand, and hopefully is consistent among teachers that share students. Okay, so that was some of my tips and tricks from lessons learned from the spring about setting up your learning system. Now we're going to talk about what are we actually using for our instructional tools outside of our learning management system. So my first advice is learn your learning management system and use all of the functionality within that first, and then decide if you need and it's worth it to bring in outside instructional tools. So I have just a couple of questions for you to contemplate what makes something worth it to bring in. And pretty much it's, will this really benefit students in a way that my learning management system doesn't have? Is it going to really benefit your time and ability to focus on the learning instead of the technology? Is it free? And then I added this last question just today because in the spring, when teachers were sending kids out to a lot of other websites that had practice involved in them, which could be great activities, it was sometimes hard for co-teachers and special ed teachers and interventionists to see students' progress in those other websites. So just keep in mind who needs to see students' progress and are they able to keep track of what the students are doing through the tools that you are choosing. And we've all seen this kind of chart that is pictured here. We see them in magazines, those choose what you think and you come out at the end. So I've made one for you to guide your thinking in choosing instructional tools. Now, again, this is just one way to think about it. There's a ton of stuff out there, but this is how my brain works and how I kind of think about if using this new instructional tool that's popped up in a Facebook group is worth it. So you can humor me. So first, as we've been talking this whole month, what is your instructional goal? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? Please don't say, oh, this tool's so great, I'll figure out how to use it in my classroom. Figure out what you want your students to be doing based on your targeted teaching and learning cycle, and then find a tool if you need one. So like I said, first, does your learning management system have the functionality that you need? If yes, stop there unless you have a really good reason why you want to try something new. And sometimes we will. If your learning management system doesn't have it, my next question is it free? Free to me. Did my district purchase it? Is there a pro trial that will actually last all year long? I'm not interested in getting used to and getting my students used to something that's going to get cut off in 6 months. Or is it something that's always free? And there's plenty of free things out there. And districts are purchasing great tools like Kami and Pear Deck and things like that that make things interactive. But if you don't buy it. If it is free, your students already know how to use it. And I ask that before I ask you if you already know how to use it, because I keep the end user in mind first. We found this in the spring as we started using Google Classroom. Some teachers who had never used it before were really nervous about the experience the students were going to have, but our students were more familiar with the tool because other teachers had already played with Google Classroom, not to its fullest extent, but at least used it while we were still in person. So if students already have familiarity with the tool, it's a good way to go. If not, that's okay. You're going to ask yourself, is the functionality of the tool worth teaching the students how to use it? And if not, you're not going to go there. If yes, your students already know how to use it, then you're going to ask, do you already know how to use this tool? And again, if you don't already know how to use the tool, ask yourself, is it worth learning? Is what I'm going to get out of it worth the time I'm going to take to learn how to use it? And if yes, then the last piece I think about is, how much time does it take to create instructional materials using this tool? And I'm going through this myself, and a lot of people who went down this path with me are finding that these are really cool ways to make these adaptive and interactive materials, and I can link to here and there and give all this feedback. But is what I'm creating too time consuming for what I'm getting out of it at the end? And so that's up to you on an individual basis. I know for myself, some of the Google slide stuff that we have been working with all month in short snippets, I think are really effective, but I would not be trying to string together, 10 problems in a row that all send kids in different directions based on their answers. I would keep it to really short, checks for understanding, exit tickets, quick feedback, assessing for prerequisite skills, those kinds of things. And then you have your answer. Is it worth using it or not? To summarize all of that is pretty much comes down to these three things. What's your goal? Always keeping your goal in mind. Do you already have a tool that you can use, or do you need a free one? Are you and your students already familiar with this tool? And then is it worth the time to get this tool up and running and to create materials in order to meet your goal? I would love to hear your feedback on that thinking process. Again, it's how my brain works. What other questions do you consider when you are choosing instructional tools? Please, reach out in our Facebook groups or email me your thoughts. Deliberate practice. This to me is one of the hardest parts of online learning, because it takes a long time and students need a lot of practice, a lot of materials. And this is where we would typically, especially in, say, a math class, hand out the practice problems or the problems in the book, and there's plenty to do, and all you need is a piece of paper. But now we're at home. And I get it. I'm a big believer that students need something on their desks as they're learning to keep them engaged. They should be taking notes. They should be writing, annotating, marking questions, concept mapping, working out their thinking in some way. But it is exhausting thinking about recreating each and every one of those things to fill a whole day of learning online. So we need to get creative on how to put the practice in the hands of the students. And if we've done the prep work on laying the foundation of what it means to be a learner, then I think this will be easier in the long run. So we need to move students away from work completion to what does it mean to have content mastery, at least in incremental steps. As students get older, you can put them in the driver's seat even more, pairing up students to write each other questions to answer from different class periods or from group to group or from teacher to teacher, making practice quizzes for other students to complete. One of the most powerful comprehension activities I've had was pairing up with another teacher, and after we read a chapter, one group of students in my class wrote a set of questions for a group of students in the other class to answer, and then they checked each other's work. And you really have to know what's in that chapter of that book in order to write good questions. And they were actually much harder on each other than we would have been on them as well. And that is a simple way to bring in an authentic task with an audience other than yourself to increase that that ownership. So we should not be doing, bottom line is we as teachers should not be doing all of the work. Remember the instructional practice guides and the 5 E's. Students need to be doing that heavy lifting. So even today, my goal is not to just give you the organization, right? And I can't because we're all in different situations, but I'm giving you tools and tips and questions to consider to put you in the driver's seat of your own organization. I will give you the snippets of ideas, examples, and even some templates of materials that I have made, but only you can teach your class with the students that you have. So I have been playing around with a few things that I think can replace those worksheets. And I hope this inspires you to come up with your own ideas. I hope you bring them back to our Facebook group and ask questions for your own context, your own courses that you are designing. Even if you don't know how to create it online yet, I would love to hear your idea or see what worksheet you typically rely on so that we can work together to recreate it in a way that is engaging for students online. This is a math take on Spot the Imposter. I learned this from one of my professors in grad school, learning to be a reading teacher. And this takes the guesswork out of a typical true-false statement worksheet. And so they know that everything is wrong and it's their job to find the mistake and correct it. So that in any content area is a low-tech way to recreate just a true-false answer. And this one I created for math. I purposely made a mistake in this equation. Can you spot it as I come out of presentation mode? Oops. And then this, again, I've shown you this probably 3 weeks in a row now. My cousin Jenny, again, math teacher in Texas, showed me how to do these magic text help. And it is so simple. You just change a hint or the correct answer to the same color text as the page, or white if there's no background color. And then if students don't need the hint, they don't need it, or they can check their answer. And if not, they can see it right there. And then they can type their response. This is something we started to do in the spring, just color in the boxes so that it would draw students' attention. They knew if there was a yellow box, they had to write in it. And then hopefully they would catch the mistake. Why should it be +5 instead of -5? And they can type in, you forgot to carry down the negative sign with the 2x. And it just gets them thinking about the mistakes that we make and why. Next, I've really been playing around with how to make digital manipulatives and simple cubes. Somebody asked this question on Facebook a while back, and looking around, you can make your own base 10 blocks if you're working with little kids in math right out of a cube. And so I am sharing these slides with you in my resources, so you can feel free to copy these and use them for yourself. And I've played around with just making a little regrouping station here. I've already moved the blocks in for time's sake, but if they're doing 16 plus 25, they'd move the 16 to 10s and the 6 ones in first, and then the 25, 1 10 and 6 ones, and then 2 10 rods and 5 ones. And then over here they have a little regrouping station, and you can teach them how to hold shift or control on the keyboard and select all 10 at one, so they can drag them on over and then take their 10 block, and now they can count and get the answer. I also have a subtraction one. How do we regroup? So this one, we start with the 25. We need to take away the 16, but we don't have enough ones. And so here you can teach them how you can drag and drop this entire group of objects together. You're going to trade in one of your 10 rods and then take the 10 ones, and then you can subtract your 16, and you're going to do that by dragging the X's over the cubes you don't need. Six, and then the 10, and then you can count up that you have 9 left. Not gonna lie, I'm pretty proud of that one. So if you like it, let me know. And if you want it, it is in my resources. And then another one I've seen a lot of, the University of Florida Literacy Institute has a lot of great resources and materials created online using Microsoft PowerPoint to teach reading. But this is a simple, any kind of bingo chip activity, or this is an Elconian box for real little kids. So if you're doing cat, you could share your screen or the kids can practice on their own. Cat or ship or whatever you are doing. So you can just use simple circles to make manipulatives as well. This next one is an activity that we did in an 8th grade social studies team I worked with. We were studying Andrew Jackson and all of the ways he tried to move the country forward while mistreating other groups of people. And so the students were weighing the pros and cons of his accomplishments, and we had tied into math what they were learning, practicing positive and negative integers. So they can drag their diamond onto the approval rating chart, and then they can type a few notes in for their reasons why they chose what they did. And then they are going to go to Flipgrid. I'm going to show you an example of to verbalize their argument on why they gave him that final approval rating. speaking of, student discussion and discourse, right? Asking and answering questions. This is a big question online, is how do I actually get my students collaborating when we're not together? And really don't overthink it. Figure out what works for you and your students and what you need first, right? If you are looking, especially for older students, if you are answering each other back and forth, you can use a simple Google Doc. You can use Flipgrid for video. I've been playing around with Google Jamboard, and I think I have an idea. I'm going to show you that, and I'm looking forward to your feedback and your ideas. And then if you're using Google Classroom, a simple question assignment type allows students to respond to a prompt you give, and then once they respond, they can see and reply to each other's answers. And you can also just throw up a material and they can comment back and forth on that. But I'm going to show you some of my examples. So Google Jamboard is free. Google has put it right inside the 3 dots or the 9 dots of all of your Google apps, and you can set it to share with your students, share it with them, and then everyone can collaborate on it at the same time. So this is an activity that I typically do in the classroom as we're reading. I'll put up chart paper and have the students put sticky notes on the chart paper as they find literary devices in the text. And so I was thinking if I created a board for each type, then they could put up sticky notes as they found them. His fingers were icicles. I can't spell icicles. And then their page, and then the name. And then that goes right on the board, and they can move it around wherever they want to. And they can categorize their literary devices as they're reading. So they would have this up. They might not be reading it totally synchronously, but then at some point, and I would do this in my classroom, I would come back and I would assign groups. So you 5, you look at all of the metaphor sticky notes and decide, are they really metaphors or are they not? Or I would have students say, okay, pick 3 literary devices off the board, go back in the book, and then analyze what does that literary device do for the text and help deepen the understanding of the reader. So I'm looking forward to your feedback on this idea and any other ideas that you might use for an interactive whiteboard like this. Again, we don't need to overthink it, especially for our older students. If we had day 1, read the text and annotate it, and then day 2, reread your annotations, choose a passage, and write a question that will prompt your classmate to think more deeply. Again, just example questions, not fully thought out assignments, just demonstrating the technology. But you could have students, type their name and their question, and then the following day, students can choose, or you can assign by typing in students' names, which questions they answer. This is another example of how we put students in the driver's seat of collaborating with each other. It doesn't always have to come from the teacher. This could be a great review for a quiz in any content area. And then the last one is Flipgrid. And I've just really started playing around with this. You share this link and students either use a QR code or you've entered their usernames. So I just did a test student, and then you pick go, and then you see the teacher's prompt up here, and you see other students answers down here and you can play it, and then you can record your own response. That's a good way to get students just talking to each other, verbalizing their understanding of the content. The last thing I want to show you today, and it's just about 3 o'clock, this is where my own thinking is right now in what will our hybrid models look like? What does our class time look like? How are our students engaging with content at home and then making the most of our class time? And I know for myself and a lot of teachers that I work with, having students in different places can become discombobulating. So again, disclaimer, these are works in progress. This is work I have not had to do yet. None of us have really done a hybrid model unless you're already opened up in your school. So part of the conversation I hope keeps us connected is let's try out some of our thinking based on our research, and let's get back together to talk about what's working and what's not. It will also look differently based on what kind of hybrid model your school has. My district is looking at a Monday, Tuesday cohort and a Thursday, Friday cohort, and everybody's home on Wednesday. So I've been trying to wrap my head around what that might look like in classrooms. So I'm going to show you these. Just you can see work in progress in the corner. Feedback, ideas, questions, welcome. This is just where my head is thinking right now. And just for organization's sake, you see cohort A is in person on Monday and Tuesday, and B is at home. And so I've devised activities that can be done at home that are not dependent on the in-school activities, because I really want to get to know my students and review how the class is going to work in person. But what can they do at home? They can do a scavenger hunt of my learning management system. They can write an introduction letter to me about themselves as learners. And then what are we all doing when we're at home on Wednesdays? So in here, I've kind of flip-flopped the activities for the in-person and the at-home learners. And then an example of what this might look like later in the year once we have gotten going. I've added those yellow days where the students are doing the same things, whether they are in person or at home. You can see on that day 2, if I'm performing a read aloud, I might be live streaming that from my classroom, or I might have already pre-recorded it for the students at home if you're not live streaming. And then they can all be practicing sentences based on the reading aloud at home. And then there are some flip-flopped activities for them to do, whether when they are at home or in person, based on what makes sense for the instructional goal for that day, where they are as learners, what kind of support they need. And then I'm really looking at those Wednesday days for, independent practice, or teachers pulling small groups, doing some one-on-one conferences. And that could actually be a pretty powerful tool to keep that connection and that feedback. That also might be a good time to work with students when you've identified they're missing some of those prerequisite skills and you don't have the rest of the class there. So I'm looking for ideas, suggestions, questions, as we all are thinking outside of the box and we are on this journey together. We are all learning. And that brings us to our next steps. Please go to our Facebook groups. My Facebook page has our notes section, and there is a survey for feedback in the description of this video, as well as it will be in the notes section as soon as I am done recording. And if you want to keep in touch directly, make sure I have your email address, and I will keep you up to date on my understanding, my learning, my research as we move forward in this school year. And once again, these are all of my social media tags, my email address, my Facebook page. Keep in touch with me any way that you prefer. If you think that your school, your team, your PLC, your department might benefit from a tailored coaching session on any of the topics or any other topics you have brewing that you would like a thought partner with, please send me an email so that we can collaborate on an individual basis. And I hope to see you all on Facebook. Have a great afternoon.